Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Free Thinking Podcast. My name is Scott Olson here with Dr. Tim Stratton. And Tim, I got to tell you, I'm really excited for this episode because we're switching roles a little bit.
How the turntables.
Yes.
Or something like that.
As the great Michael Scott would say.
Yeah, you know what? I'm kind of looking forward to this too. You typically over the last few years, while we've been doing the Free Thinking Podcast, most of the time you're interviewing me. But now you're becoming a philosopher. You're studying. You're getting your master's degree at Biola University, studying philosophy. And so now it's the conversation between the theologian and the philosopher. And I've got a lot of questions for you. So I think going forward, I might be interviewing you just as much as you interview me. And maybe we're just going to have some great conversations. I don't know.
I love it. Yeah. So I thought kind of today we could talk about, I took my intro to metaphysics class this past semester and really enjoyed it. A lot of fun. It's one of the more, I would say, for the average listener that isn't like steeped in philosophical jargon and knowledge, some of the questions can appear a little bit, maybe it's like, I don't understand the relevance of it. At least that's been my experience because I have these conversations like with my friends and my fiance, and like we talk about it. And she, my fiance in particular, did not find it as interesting as perhaps epistemology was. So hopefully you guys find it interesting as well.
Well, I want to do a couple different series of videos here with you. I want to talk about your metaphysics class, and then I want to interview you also and talk about your epistemology class in the future. So, and I find this highly interesting because, I get into both of those aspects in my work, in my theological studies.
They're indispensable to your work.
They really are. In fact, the free thinking argument is a metaphysical argument dealing in epistemology. So I really have to make sure I surround myself with good philosophers, and you're one of them. So looking forward to this.
Sweet. Let's do it.
All right. So I guess the first thing, first tell us what exactly metaphysics is. What is the metaphysician studying, or what is the study of metaphysics? And also, what sorts of things are talked about within the topics or within the topic of metaphysics?
Yeah. So it turns out that defining metaphysics is actually kind of a difficult question because there's a number of different ways to think about it. My professor, and I agree with his assessment of this, which is actually good. Well, it's interesting because I feel like so many philosophical schools of thought make sense to me because you're just heavily influenced by who you learn from. And so it's like whoever was the first book you picked up, it's probably the person that's influenced you the most. Just because that's the categories that you've been taught everything in.
Right.
Which fortunately for me, I feel like I got a really good education from my professor. So I'm really grateful for that.
Can you share his name with us?
Sure. Yeah. It's Dr. Pickavance at university. He's really, really good. And I didn't agree with him on everything, but I found that he taught things. He has a gift for making kind of complicated things, not simplistic, but simple enough to understand, especially if you're new to the field. So I really valued getting to know him and getting to learn from him. He's great. Yeah. But anyway, so metaphysics, the way he kind of talked about this, and you pretty much take the word is, right? And you understand what are the different meanings of this word. And then that's kind of what we talk about in metaphysics.
Well, so you're telling me that Bill Clinton was onto something.
He's more profound than you or I would probably ever give him credit for. Assuming that's what he was getting at in that particular interchange. But the meanings of this word, and you'll see what I mean, kind of have very profound implications. So, for example, we can say God is, right? So this is a question of existence, right? We're asking, hey, does God exist or doesn't he, right? So, or Tim Stratton is, like, when we say Tim Stratton exists, we're saying he is, like he is a being. So that's one question. What is existence? What does it mean to exist? How does that impact, the way the world is? We could say that Clark Kent is Superman, right? Which is an identity statement. That's another way we can use the word is, right? So we're saying this person, Clark Kent, and Superman are identical. We're saying that that's what we mean by is. And then we could also say Scott Olson is human. And that's a statement of my essence, right? So in other words, part of what it means to be Scott Olson is to be human. So I'm saying this is an essential part of me, right? But on the other hand, we could also say Scott Olson is 5'9", which is an accidental feature that I have. So typically you can distinguish between types of properties that you have or features of your being. If you don't want to get into the nuances of properties, you could say there are essential aspects of my being, which means that I wouldn't be who I am if I didn't possess these things. So like I couldn't be Scott Olson and not be human, right? Because that's just part of what it means. But it seems reasonable to say, oh, I'm Scott Olson, but I was 5'11" or 6'4", like I wanted to be when I was young. That's an accidental feature. It just happens to be the case that I'm 5'9". I could have failed to be 5'9" and still be Scott Olson, right?
Yeah.
And then another use of the word is might be in questions of the past and the future. So, for example, Tim was, or which is the past tense of was a youth pastor, which is a statement about the way things used to be. But Tim is now a theologian, apologist, and Tim will be, again, be is the base word there. I don't know, bald. But yeah, so metaphysics kind of studies all of those different kinds of questions. And that's, so I would say start with the word is, think about all the different ways it can mean things. And that's pretty much what we talk about in metaphysics.
All right. So a study of the word is, that's basically what I took from that.
Yeah, it's the study of reality, but
there you go.
This kind of parses out into more categories.
Yeah. I've typically understood metaphysics to be the study of ultimate reality, but you're saying that that's disputed.
Well, I don't think it's disputed. I think that is ultimately what it is, but I think that doesn't in itself tell you a whole lot about what is studied. And so if you take the word is, you can understand, oh, these are the sorts of things that we talk about.
Yeah. All right, great. Okay, so when you say metaphysics studies those questions, tell me exactly what you mean. I mean, what is there to study about them? Because don't they kind of seem straightforward?
Well, I mean, that's kind of what you think, but I'm sure, as you can attest, a lot of things that on the surface seem very obvious and straightforward have some like interesting and difficult ideas to reckon with, because as you start to think through these things and examine what these statement means, you realize there are implications as a result of certain views that you hold. So a good place to begin discussing these questions is to understand what we say when we say what we really mean when we say one of these statements is true, right? So there's a number of different theories of truth, believe it or not. But in my class, we primarily focused on two. One is the correspondence theory of truth, which you've referenced on the podcast before. And two is the deflationary theory of truth. So we'll just get into those real quick. So obviously, as with most philosophical theories, there are going to be a number of different ways in which you can construe these theories. So it's probably not entirely accurate to say this is the correspondence theory or the deflationary theory, because again, like they're going to have their own flavors depending on which philosopher you're going to be talking to. But in general, this is kind of the way you can understand them. So the correspondence theory of truth says that a thing is true if and only if there's sort of a match between what the thing says and what the world is. So the match there is where you get the correspondence. It corresponds with one another. So what that means is in any statement, there's going to be two components to it. There's this saying side, right? So what's it saying? And then the world side of the relation. So the world side is the way things are. And so typically the saying side of a statement is thought of in terms of proposition, which if you've ever heard the term proposition, they are just non-linguistic, which just means they're language agnostic. They don't care what language they're uttered in. So the phrase "snow is white" in English is the same proposition as it uttered in Spanish or French or whatever language you choose. It's still referring to the same representational content, right? So that's kind of what a proposition is. It's that non-linguistic content of the statement that you're saying.
Yeah.
And then the world side is where we tended to spend more time. So there actually is some debate on the saying side about whether or not propositions exist, or what exactly they are, or whether or not, I mean, even what I said about languages, like there was debate, and there might even still be debate about, okay, does the language matter? Are we saying the same thing? Is that how we should think about things? So I don't want to give the impression that side's necessarily settled. But for our purposes, we'll assume that propositions are fairly well understood things. It's because I think the world side is, especially from a Christian perspective, probably a more interesting area for us. I mean, at least for me it was, because the world side talks about, okay, we know what we're saying, but how does that match the way the world is? So we need to understand the way the world is to know if what we're saying matches that. Right. So, according to the correspondence theory, a statement is true if the propositional content of a statement accurately describes the world, right? Seems pretty straightforward there. But this type of thought seems to indicate the existence of things that are called truthmakers, right? So, truthmakers are those things which exist that make a proposition true, okay? Pretty straightforward definition, right? But there are a number of different varieties of truthmaker theory, depending on pretty much the question, how many truthmakers do you think there are? So most correspondence theorists would admit to the existence of some truthmakers, because that seems to be the most natural way to understand what we mean by correspondence.
Yeah.
But there's just, debate. How many do we need? So one of the views is truthmaker maximalism, which is kind of what it sounds like. Just basically, for any true statement, there has to exist a truthmaker. However, this is not a very popular view for a couple of reasons. The truthmaker maximalism, it struggles with what are called negative existential statements, right? So let's say, for example, the statement, there are no unicorns, right? Well, what is the truthmaker that exists that makes that statement true? Because if you're saying there aren't, if you say there are unicorns, well, it's obvious what the truthmaker is. It's the unicorns that make that statement true. But if you're saying there are no unicorns, it seems on truthmaker maximalism, you would have to say, hey, there's this thing that exists called no unicorn that is an existing thing in the world that makes that statement true, which it's kind of an odd view, but I suppose you could hold to it. But then that leads to another problem, which, especially for Christians, I think would be difficult to hold, and that is that makes the number of contingent things that exist in the world, like the number has to be what it is now. There could not be more and there could not be less than what there is now of things that exist, which would make God's creation necessary. Because in order for God to have not created anything, he would have had to create the no Tim Stratton thing or the no Scott Olson thing in order for this to be true. And so that's kind of one of the difficulties with truthmaker maximalism. But so that's kind of why, that's one of a couple of the reasons why truthmaker maximalism isn't a particularly popular view. So most philosophers, if they're going to hold to a truthmaker type of theory, they're going to take what's called an atomic truthmaker theory, which says that there are only truthmakers for the quote-unquote atomic truths. And so atomic truths are usually defined as simple and positive truths. So a simple truth is just not like a conjunction of truths, right? Because if you say Tim Stratton is bald and Scott Olson is 5'9", that is one statement, right? But it seems that there are, that whole statement doesn't need one truth maker on atomic truth maker theory. Whereas on truth maker maximalism, we would say, well, it's a separate truth than either of the conjunctions.
Wow.
And so atomic truth maker theory says, well, because I've defined the need for truth makers to simple positive truths, I don't have to provide a single truth maker for that conjunction. I just need to provide one for the first simple truth and the second simple truth. And since they're positive, basically that meaning that they do posit the existence of something, not the non-existence of something, then they do have a truth maker. Whereas it also handles the there are no unicorns case, because rather than saying there exists a truth maker called like no unicorn or something like that, you just say, well, what makes that true is the fact that there's like a falsity maker type of thing, that there isn't a unicorn to make that statement false. And so that's kind of, as you encounter, and then there's a ton to go over for truth maker theory, but typically most debates will happen in the atomic realm. And if you're going to go in the way of truth makers, and then there are other truth maker theories that say that there's truth making, but there's not truth makers, which I'm not going to get into that. But that is a view that has some support today. Particularly that was like David Lewis' view. He held to this view called like truth supervenes on being, which actually I find kind of interesting. I don't know that I would buy it, but I think it's an interesting one, but we don't have to get into that. So that's another way you could define a truth maker theory, is say, no, there's not truth makers, but there is truth making. And so that kind of gets into a whole nother realm of things.
Well, this is related to Molinism, and the Molinism.
Yes, very much so. Right? And you can probably speak to that a little bit.
Well, just we have what's called the grounding objection. And that is, well, what makes this counterfactual knowledge true? What grounds it, right? And so I spend a little bit of time, as you started talking about this, I grabbed my book, Euquibus Erasmus and I wrote a journal article about this a couple years ago, and I shared part of this in my book. And so we go through, we start with different ways in which people can and look at this. And so the first one is, we say, okay, a true contingent proposition is true in virtue of the existence of some concrete objects. But then we show some problems with that. So then we move to another one, and I say a true contingent proposition is true in virtue of the existence or past existence of some concrete objects. But then we show some problems with that. So we move to the next one. Okay, this one will work. 3, a true contingent proposition is true in virtue of the existence, past existence, or future existence of some concrete objects. But then we show some problems with that. Here's the fourth way to understand it. A true contingent proposition is true in virtue of the existence, past existence, future existence, or non-existence of some concrete objects. And finally, after showing some problems with that, we finish with this one. A true contingent proposition is true in virtue of the fact that some concrete objects exist, or did exist, or will exist, or do not exist, or would exist under specific conditions. So we say the adjustment in this fifth way of understanding it seems to be as reasonable as the fourth, and thus if the grounding objection were to succeed, a person must show why 5 is implausible while 4 is plausible. And we say that we don't think that that's been done yet. So therefore, there's good reasons to believe that God, as a maximally great being, has middle knowledge. So anyway, I won't give all the details there, but if people want to go look at that, I'll promote the book again.
Yeah.
But that's chapter 15, I think.
Yeah. And we'll talk more about counterfactual statements, because they actually are one of the more interesting problems amongst metaphysicians, no matter which view you choose or whichever kind of school of thought you're going to take, because it's okay, how do we make sense of these things where they're not talking about the way the world is, they're talking about the way the world could be, right? Which again was one of our questions, that was,
or would have been
if. Yes, exactly. And so Truthmaker concerns are, I mean, certainly not unique to like a Molinistic view, but they are a way that, or a thing that is something that Molinists do, provide an account for. And I think you gave a good point in your book. Basically, at least it seems to me that the Truthmaker concerns for Molinism are no more than any other view. Like maybe we don't have like an exact view, but it seems to me, especially that example you gave, that your particular Truthmaker theory is no more or less preferable than others that are given. Like you'd have to provide some sort of positive argument as to okay, why is this particular conjunction, like you said your and could exist and will exist, and it's like, well, why is this one any less valid than the other ones that we talked about? So again, I think while yes, it is an interesting question and something that I think Molinists do and should wrestle with, I don't think it's by any means a area where it's a huge defeater to Molinism.
Yeah, it's not a deal breaker.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I don't feel the force, I should say. I've said this for 2 or 3 years now as I've studied the grounding objection. I don't feel the force of the objection. I don't feel a need to change my view or drop my view. I just don't just don't feel the force. I'm not impacted by it. But maybe there's something wrong with my intuitions. I don't know.
Could be. But yeah, I will say, after studying it, I would agree. I would agree with you. So that is the correspondence theory, which is, I guess for me, it feels more like the common sense view of truth. But that's not to say, maybe, like you said, maybe other people have different intuitions. But the other theory that we'll talk about just in brief is not even necessarily a theory about, it is a theory about truth, but it's interesting. So it's the deflationary theory.
Yeah.
So deflationists about truth deny that truth is like, it's like a kind of property that attaches to propositions. So they just say, to say that something is true is actually just to affirm that something is that thing, right? So the statement snow is white is true just means snow is white, right? So like there's nothing, like truth doesn't really, like it's not a thing that like attaches to a property. It cannot be said of a proposition that something is true. It just is that thing. And the primary one with that is like, what are we even doing in philosophy or science or, ethics or anything like that if we're not discovering truth? Like, what is the point of science or even what we're doing now if we're not discovering truth? That seems to just mean it's kind of a useless enterprise, which, maybe it is, but I'm not ready to give it up.
Do the deflationists have a reason for adopting that view? Why do they find it preferable?
Well, I think it's simpler, right? So if you say truth isn't a property that exists, you're saying there isn't anything, you're not adding more things to your ontology or to your theory of the way things work, right? So you're saying truth is an unnecessary addition that we've added to our way of thinking. So I would imagine that would be the primary reason, is the simplicity of it.
Okay.
So yeah, that's kind of truth. So if you thought, oh, truth is simple, turns out there are some interesting questions.
Related to I'd be remiss if I did not bring up the new Marvel series, which is going to be on Disney Plus, just called What If.
Okay.
Yeah. So I
saw the poster. Do you know what that's about?
I mean, if memory serves, they used to have a comic when I was younger along the same lines, I think with the same title, and just kind of showing crazy stories of what would happen if things would have been different.
Yeah.
And so, it's a good piece of fiction based on counterfactual knowledge, I guess.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and that's actually interesting. That's an interesting point. I'll just bring that up again in relating to the grounding objection. And I think certainly the intuition is kind of on the Molinist side, because we seem to want to say we know some counterfactual truths of creaturely freedom, right?
Mhm.
Like we want to say, and if knowledge is justified true belief, at least, plus,
Yeah.
whatever you want to say
Right.
it is, then truth is an indispensable part of it. So it seems that if you're saying that there are like Truthmaker concerns about that, it's like, well, then it seems that nobody could know anything in the philosophical point.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
yeah, at least that's the way I think about it. But
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you think that's a good spot to cut off this first one?
Yeah. And we'll start up again here, and I got some more questions for you.
Sounds good. See you guys next week.